I am the director here at Northeastern's Alumni Office, and we're very happy to have you join us today. With that, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, so let's get the program going, and we're going to pass it off to Nick Beek.
Hey everyone, I'm Nick Beek, class of 2012. I'm one of the co-lead volunteers for the Washington, D.C. network. If you haven't already, I encourage you to get involved with your local Northeastern alumni community. You can see upcoming events over at alumni.northeastern.edu. But first, I want to take a moment to thank the many alumni, friends, and staff, especially the staff, that helped support us last week on Giving Day. We had over 17,000 alumni and friends join and support Northeastern on that day, which 100% of the funds go directly to programs that now help our students. Thank you for joining us today for this event. I want to give a couple of housekeeping items before we start. First, if you can please leave your cameras off and microphones muted. It helps with the Zoom bandwidth and minimizes any mistaken background noises. Don't hear from your puppies as much. And in the top right corner of your screen, you should see a drop down that allows you to move your screen to speaker mode, which we recommend for getting the best experience. Lastly, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to write them in the chat box and we'll make sure we get them over to our panelist. Now, I'd like to pass it over to the Director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, Jennie Stephens.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nick, and great to be here with all of you. We have a great panel, and we're looking forward to an interactive session with all of you as well. Let me just pull up our slides here. And I just want to welcome you all, and we're going to be talking about climate justice today. And the three of us are going to introduce ourselves and then each share some of our work and our perspective on what is climate justice. And we'll be thinking about climate justice at multiple scales: international, domestic, local, regional, and even thinking about what does climate justice mean for universities and for us here at Northeastern. So my name is Jennie Stephens, and I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs here. And I'm also involved in the Global Resilience Institute and a professor of sustainability science and policy. And I've been studying climate and energy for my whole career for the past 25 years with a science and engineering background, but increasingly interested in the social and political dimensions of climate and energy. So very interested currently in connecting our climate action with social justice, racial justice, and economic justice. So Frances, maybe could you introduce yourself briefly?
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jennie. I'm so excited to be here for this really timely panel, and also excited to just learn from everyone today. I believe in co-learning. So my name is Frances Roberts-Gregory. I am a future faculty fellow here at Northeastern University. I'm also being mentored by Jennie Stephens, so really excited to be on the panel. And I would describe myself as an eco-womanist ethnographer and feminist political ecologist. In the past, I have actually consulted for the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and I'm a co-founding member of the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal and a proud advocate for feminist climate justice. So excited to get into that a little bit later today. And I guess now I will pass it to Brian.
Thanks, Frances, and welcome everybody. My name is Brian Helmuth. I'm what I call a reluctant climate scientist. I never set out to get into the field of climate, but as a marine ecologist, I kept traveling the world and my study systems kept dying. And so I ended up as a climate change biologist. Fast forward a little bit, I had kids and realized that I can no longer just study the decline of natural systems. I had to do something about it. So I moved into policy and science communication. So now I'm have a joint appointment in the Department of Marine Environmental Sciences, as well as the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. And I also work with our Coastal Sustainability Institute, as well as our Global Resilience Institute. So I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit more about what I do.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian. So what we're going to do now is I'll just speak for about 10 minutes and share a little bit about my own work, and then Frances will share, and then Brian will, and then we can open it up. So to begin, I'd like to just say kind of right out from the onset, what are we talking about when we talk about climate justice? And there are many different definitions and different ways of thinking about it. But for me, it's really about getting beyond the conventional decarbonization type climate action that tends to be very technocratic and focused on greenhouse gas emission reductions and kind of this assumption that technology will is central to the transformations that are needed, which of course technology is really important, but also recognizing that the climate crisis is an opportunity to reevaluate and restructure society more broadly. And we have to acknowledge that so many of our policies and practices and processes are actually perpetuating climate change, the climate crisis, and injustices of all kinds, social injustices, racial injustice, economic injustice. So we want to be connecting those and taking responsibility for our actions and our contributions to both injustice and the climate crisis. And it's critical to also consider that climate impacts are not equally distributed. And so there are a lot of disparities and inequities with climate, as there are in so many other areas, and that we really need transformation to address these interconnected issues. And we really, I argue that we will not be effective in addressing the climate crisis until and unless social justice, racial justice, and economic justice is prioritized in our climate actions. So I recently wrote a book called Diversifying Power: Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And I just wanted to share a little bit about that book and why the kind of leadership that we have is so essential in thinking about how we address the intersecting crises of our time. So we don't always think about climate in terms of economic terms, but I like to point out how important it is to realize how the widening income and wealth gaps in the United States in particular, but this is happening all over the world, is actually directly connected to our ineffectiveness at responding to the climate crisis. So this just shows, just over the past 40 years, how the top 1% has gotten an increasingly higher percentage of the share of national income and share of national wealth, whereas everybody else's percentage has been declining. So this is showing a concentration of wealth and power that is very strategic, and it's very, it would have been preventable, and you can see here, this is unsustainable. We can't keep going like this. And this is actually pre-pandemic. Over the past year, these numbers have gotten even worse. So the billionaires continue to profit and off of everybody else. And it's really demonstrating how exploitative our systems are. So this is connected to climate and energy because, as Dario Kenner points out, the polluter elite are a lot of the top 1% who've actually been strategically investing to resist climate action and a transformation in our society toward more renewables in order to sustain their concentrated wealth and power. So they've been doing that through investing in a misinformation campaign to deny climate science, and Brian's going to talk more about climate science. They've also been investing to undermine our trust in government, that government can actually protect us and protect public health and the public good. And they've also been minimizing worker protections and worker rights. In corporate culture 40 years ago, many companies were proud of how they treated their workers, whereas there's been a cultural shift in corporations where they really prioritize shareholder wealth and try to minimize how much they're investing in their workers. So this is something that we all need to be very aware of, and that we need to work on resisting this and restructuring this. So I talk about leadership a lot. And when I talk about leadership, I'm not just talking about CEOs of companies or elected officials. I'm talking about how we frame and consider and engage with the climate crisis. And for a long time, we have thought about the climate change as like a separate issue that's isolated from other issues. We tend to think of it in very scientific terms with technology as the focus, and we've invested a lot in technological innovation. But when we think of climate in kind of separate ways like this, we've actually been missing opportunities for investing in improving what we need as human beings and kind of more integrated approach. So what I propose, another way to think about it is acknowledge that we need to move away from fossil fuels toward a renewable-based future. And that provides us an opportunity to invest in people and communities and base those investments on social justice and human dignity. And we can move toward a renewable-based future in which power is distributed literally and figuratively, right? Literally every community around the world has access to renewable resources, whether it be the sun or wind, or coastal communities also have potentially wave and tidal and offshore wind. Inland communities can have geothermal as well as wind and solar at different scales. So if we think about locally owned and managed and distributed renewable resources with lots of different kinds of heterogeneous mix of renewable energy, we can envision a future that is not reliant on the exploitative and very dangerous and public health crisis associated with fossil fuels. So in what I like to think about leadership and what I talk about anti-racist feminist leadership, I really think about the Squad. And the Squad are these 4 junior congresswomen who came on the national stage just in the last 2.5 years, and they've just changed the conversation in terms of climate. And they've done that by connecting the climate crisis with jobs and economic justice, connecting climate and energy with housing and transportation equity, and structural racism and criminal justice reforms. So this kind of leadership is acknowledging the power structures that have disadvantaged so many people for so long and given privilege to others, and recognizing that we don't want to perpetuate that. We need to respond in ways that distribute wealth and power and prioritize investments in communities and worker rights in ways that reduce inequities and disparities by centering social justice, racial justice, and economic justice. And the way to really make the transformative changes that we need is by linking these problems together, not thinking of them in isolation. And obviously the antithesis of anti-racist feminist leadership is patriarchal leadership, which is very intentionally based on domination, exclusion, and competition. It's really designed to continue to concentrate wealth and power and exacerbate inequities and disparities. And the only way patriarchal leadership is sustained is by denying the problem. So we have seen over the past 4 years how not just denying that the climate is something we need to address, but denying the pandemic or the dangers of the coronavirus, by denying the structural racism, denying the economic crisis or the housing crisis that we're facing in this country. So if we deny problems, then you don't have to do anything about them, and you can tell people that everything's fine, even though that doesn't resonate with people's experience. So in my book, I went through a whole lot of stories about innovative, creative leaders that are doing so much work at the grassroots, at community levels, at state level and national level and internationally, just connecting climate and energy with jobs and economic justice, connecting with health and well-being and nutritious food, connecting with clean transportation and housing justice and educational justice. And this linking is really essential to making the kinds of transformative changes that are needed. So these are just a couple of the examples of the leaders in my book that I talk about. Jackie Patterson of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She and her team has done amazing work, highlighting and working with particularly Black communities who've been manipulated by fossil fuel interests, even when those same interests end up having negative health impacts for those communities. And Jasmine Banks of Uncoke My Campus has been instrumental in showcasing how the fossil fuel industry has also been influencing our higher education and our educational systems as well. So I'll end by just saying that there's so much we can all do in terms of being engaged and leveraging our collective power based on wherever we are. We're all leaders in different ways. We can advocate for system change in different ways. We can continue to talk about and address and constantly resist structural racism and sexism. We can prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion in every level and in everything we do. We can advocate for local community renewable energy. We can leverage data science and information for change. And think about cooperative models of economic structures as another innovative thing we can do. And I also want to bring this back to, so I mentioned Mary Robinson. She is the former president of Ireland and really a climate justice advocate internationally recognized. And she has made the point that none of this should really be very radical, because it's really just about investing in people and a people first approach. And somehow we've gotten lost from that in so many of our policies and our practices. And we haven't been investing in what people need. And so that's a really important way to think about it. And I also honor Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman to run for president in 1972. And obviously in some ways we've come a long way since 1972, and we still have a long way to go. And I just want to end by connecting this back to Northeastern, and we can talk about this in the discussion. Right now there's quite a lot of activity on campus focused on climate justice action. And expanding our Northeastern's commitment to addressing climate change through our conventional climate action plan, which is now actually from 2010, and acknowledging that we want to expand that to not just be about decarbonization of the campus, but really connect it with this more integrated approach. We have a sunrise movement on campus, and some of our students are coming up with a proposal for a green NU deal, NU standing for Northeastern. And we also have a faculty committee that in the faculty senate that is calling for inclusive social and political processes and policies and practices, committing to more equitable and inclusive university community, ending fossil fuel reliance on our campuses and in the communities that we work with, and expanding kind of co-design, co-development, and partnerships with and underinvested communities and communities of color. And really, we see climate justice action at the university level as an opportunity and a responsibility for simultaneously addressing racial justice, rebuilding our community relations, and addressing ecosystem and climate destruction. So with that, I will stop sharing and I'll hand it over to Frances to share her perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny, for laying out the context of why we're here today and how important climate justice is, I would say nationally, internationally, and also at Northeastern. So as mentioned, as I mentioned during my introduction, I am a feminist political ecologist. I'm an eco-womanist ethnographer and also an eco-feminist who is getting more and more interested in policy intervention, such as the feminist agenda for a Green New Deal. And so I actually completed my doctoral research at the University of California, Berkeley, but within Louisiana, particularly in the region surrounding Bobancha, which is a Choctaw word, which means land of many tongues, which also goes by New Orleans. And so I would say that my work is situated at the intersection of environmental energy and climate justice. I see them as tributaries of the same movement for participatory environmental futures or ecological futures. And I'm really inspired by the climate activism from folk involved in organizations such as 350 New Orleans, folk such as the Sunrise Movement, even Extinction Rebellion we have here. Also folk who are involved in the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, who are long-term environmental and climate justice advocates, particularly through their HBCU Climate Change Initiative, folk involved with the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, and even folk who are fighting for a petrochemical-free future through the Coalition Against Death Alley, formerly known as Cancer Alley. So there's a lot of groups, grassroots organizations, I should say, on the ground who are really thinking critically of what it means to imagine fossil-free-ish futures. Now, today I want to talk a bit about feminist climate justice. And I think this is particularly important because many of you may or may not be familiar with this idea of climate action plans or CAPs. And there's many different states, many different entities who are thinking about how do we prepare for climate change? How do we adapt? And how do we ensure that our communities, our cities, our regions are resilient? And so Louisiana actually has its, as recently initiated a climate initiatives task force. It was an executive order established by Governor John Bel Edwards. And it's really, I think, innovative when we think of a region such as Louisiana, where fossil fuels dominate the economy. And so what does it mean to take a feminist approach to climate justice in a region such as Louisiana? And I would say the Gulf South in general. So feminist climate justice is an approach to ecological justice, which centers the leadership and climate solutions of women, BIPOC communities, LGBTQ communities, folk from the global South, and folk who are really on the fence line and front lines of climate change. Also, I would, as Jennie mentioned, feminist climate justice takes an intersectional lens to the triple crisis of care, climate, and COVID. It critiques false solutions to the climate crisis and techno fixes, and centers gender justice and reproductive justice when we talk about gendered and racialized care work. So what does this actually mean? What we're talking about is the importance of women's leadership. We're also talking about the reality that many of these dirty industries are male dominated, particularly dominated by white males, and that when we talk about the history of environmental degradation, we have to talk about the history of racial capitalism and also the history of patriarchy. We have to talk about the objectification of nature and how a lack of focus on ecology and kinship creates this situation where we have the rape and plunder of the earth, which parallels the rape and plunder of BIPOC communities, communities in the global South, and women and femme bodies. So as I mentioned earlier, my work is situated at the intersection of environmental energy and climate justice, which also I would say is inspired by this larger field, which I'm calling gender, race, and feminist environmentalism. And so there are many folk within gender and sustainable development, feminist political ecology, the anti-toxics movement, feminist economics, and even I would say folk who are have been advocating for Indigenous sovereignty, who talk about the need for feminist futures and also a just and equitable COVID recovery. And so during my research, I actually employed feminist activist autoethnography, which is really a feminist approach to action research, which centers a multi-scalar analysis, particularly a focus on the body and embodied knowledge. I also employed Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris's eco-womanist and Afrofuturist methodology, which is a 7-step spiral method, which I would say centers the need for honoring, experiencing, and recovering eco-memory. So this idea of situating our own biographies within the larger milieu of environmental policies and environmental actions. Also the need to critically examine history, spirituality, and tradition. So although this is a scientific method, we are actually centering spirituality, which I think is really unique. And also the need to take action for earth justice, which can take many forms through interfaith and interdisciplinary dialogue, through engaging transformation, and also through teaching. And so we're really focusing on this idea of environmental educators as activists, environmental educators as individuals who are shaping minds and planting seeds, and also engaging in oftentimes gendered healing work. So in addition to my field work here in Louisiana, since I've been at Northeastern, I've really been focused on the feminist agenda for a Green New Deal. So as I mentioned, I am a co-founding member of this eco-feminist transnational collective, and the feminist agenda for a Green New Deal has 10 principles, which we think will bring about a just and equitable recovery. And so I won't go into all of our principles. You can find them on our website, but some of them include requiring intersectional gender analysis, advancing, as I mentioned earlier, reproductive justice, respecting the leadership of youth. Youth have really been leading this climate justice conversation, and also ensuring community-led and democratic solutions. Most recently, my colleagues and I have been more engaged with this idea of the need for a care economy, and we've been pivoting some of our work to really center the policy solutions of folk on the ground who have always advocated for more robust funding and also the need to democratize care work. And so Rihanna Gunright, who many of you may or may not know, is the policy architect of the Green New Deal. She and one of her co-authors, is actually working on a policy proposal at this point, which is really looking at the Biden-Harris administration's care policies. And so they emphasize how care work is gendered and racialized. Oftentimes, care work is unpaid. And sometimes it is paid and it can be formal and informal, but it's often invisible and unrecognized. They also discuss the origins of the devaluation of care work and plantation economies and even New Deal policies. And they also focus on the need to understand that care jobs are green jobs. So when we talk about green jobs, we often think about these great infrastructural projects. We think about we talk about this need for a just transition, but a just transition also includes centering folk who work in childcare, home care, elder care, healthcare, disability and mental health care, education, and gig economies. They also discuss the need for an equitable access to clean energy jobs because, as Jenny mentioned, we don't want to replicate injustice when we transition to a energy democracy. We actually want to ensure that women and folk who are underrepresented in many of these traditional energy fields actually have well-paying unionized jobs, and also that we need to address occupational segregation and even decarbonize care infrastructure such as hospitals. So many of my colleagues are actually now enthusiastically endorsing the Thrive Act or the Thrive Agenda, which will be launched by many progressive policymakers in April this month. And the Thrive Agenda stands for Transform, Heal, and Renew by Investing in a Vibrant Economy. And you can learn more about the Thrive Agenda on the thriveagenda.com, but they really are focusing on this need of creating good, safe jobs that are unionized, also this need to invest in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, and also reinvesting in public institutions and that enable workers and communities to thrive. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I actually will conclude by saying that I'm really excited to continue my research at the intersection of feminist environmentalisms and the care economy. And I'm really excited to continue to work with my colleagues transnationally who are interested in a feminist agenda for a Green New Deal, and even this idea of how do we bring about healing justice, because this work is hard work. Many activists, communities, policymakers experience burnout, and I like to say, hurt people hurt people. So how do we ensure that this work is sustainable? How do we ensure self and collective care? And I think one way to do that is to actually fund grants towards collective care. So I'm really excited. If many of you aren't familiar with the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice, I recently joined their advisory board. And this is a philanthropic organization, or I should say foundation, that is really interested in this idea of healing justice. And so if you're interested in learning more, please check out the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal. Also, there is some of my colleagues created a website about a just and regenerative transition to care economies, COVID care economy. So please check that out. And then also you can check out the United Nations Gender and Women Constituency if you're interested in getting involved or learning more about international efforts to address the triple crisis of care, climate, and COVID. So thank you so much.
Great, Francis. Thank you so much. And thank you for focusing on that, framing that triple crisis for us and connecting care jobs with green jobs. I think so important. So Brian, hand it over to you. And then we have been getting questions and comments already in the chat, and we will be coming to them after we hear from Brian.
Great, thanks, Jenny. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm a reluctant or unintentional climate scientist, and I think that's the case for all ecologists or any environmental scientists right now. It's unavoidable. The impacts of climate change are pervasive, and likewise, justice has to be part of any discussion we have about adaptation and mitigation to climate change. And so in some ways, this makes this topic really complex, requiring a systems approach, but then it also means that it's embedded in everything. So it's hard to get a toehold on some of these issues. So I want to present this from kind of the science side. And a lot of what I do is called ecological forecasting, which I'll describe in a minute. And it relies on the observation that global climate change ultimately plays out at really local levels. It is, even though we talk about it as something separate, it is invariably interacting with a whole host of other stressors. And the same is true for adaptation solutions. So that when we try to take science and technological solutions and implement them in society, this is a really big component of this, where we know that both exposure and sensitivity to those climate change impacts are highly heterogeneous. So on the left here, you look at the increase in heat waves in a number of US cities, both in duration and frequency. And on the right, it gives you some examples of differential vulnerability to things like heat waves. And unsurprisingly, those people who are the most vulnerable are those who are already the most vulnerable to other insults. And so people who don't have access to cooling centers and air conditioners, those who are elderly or in poor health. And so like so many or virtually anything with climate change, the people who are getting hurt the worst are those who are already most vulnerable. So what work in my group does is we try to inform climate adaptation strategies, in particular inform where we should start prioritizing our efforts based on this kind of combination of exposure and sensitivity. And we do this both for people, but as I'll talk about in a minute, we also do this for non-human organisms because we're interested in how those nature-based solutions can impact positively society. And so I just want to note, and this is where the connection comes into Francis and Jenny, is science here is not telling us how to fix the problem, or at least it should not. Technology is just, in scientific solutions are providing a toolkit, but ultimately they have to empower stakeholders in order to be useful and sustainable. So much of what my group focuses on is this connection with nature and what the nature can provide to people. Francis mentioned the objectification of nature, this idea that we have dominion over nature and can use it to our will, and inevitably that comes back and bites us. And I completely agree with her assessment that the only way to fix this is to re-envision how we view nature, how we view each other, and to look at this in this systemic, systems-based approach. So, just as an example, when we look at green urban spaces or natural wetlands that prevent erosion on coastlines, or coral reefs that prevent flooding, those are all forms of nature-based solutions. So what I want to do quickly is walk you through one case study. And this is led by David Sittenfeld, who's at the Museum of Science in Boston. He's technically a graduate student in my lab, but I've learned more from him than he has from me. And it's this project called Wicked Hot Boston, where what he's been looking at are what called urban heat island effects. So we're used to thinking about air temperature when we turn on the Weather Channel, and that does impact us. But what we forget is that the local air temperature around us is driven by things like solar radiation hitting surfaces. So anybody that's ever put their hand on a hot parking lot on a hot sunny day knows that it gets a lot hotter than it does in a grassy surface. That in turn impacts air temperature and the environment that people experience around them, so that in urban environments, it can be substantially warmer than in surrounding areas. So what David did was he led a citizen science effort to measure urban heat island effects using community scientists around the Boston region. What you see on the left are a series of pathways where people drove around with thermometers. And then this on the right is a kriging procedure that reconstructs what those temperatures are. What you see is that there's a 15-degree Fahrenheit difference across the region in temperatures that people are experiencing. The South End and Ashmont were some of the hottest. So we were experiencing temperatures of over 102 degrees, 108 degrees with urban heat island effects, with heat index. And when you zoom in on Google Earth, the reason behind this is not too surprising. It's because of this large amount of pavement that is just absorbing heat from the sun. So what David did next is he asked, well, what are the historical roots of this? And it goes back to the history of redlining in Boston. So just for those who don't know, during the Great Depression in the 30s, people couldn't make mortgage payments. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created to refinance these loans. But to determine which loans would be guaranteed, they documented the types of housing and people living there. And so they had these awful racist metrics that they were calling detrimental influences that you can see examples there that are just despicable. And they led to this redlining where you can see the different regions being graded. Now, what David's work found is that if you match up those areas to the urban heat island effect, there's an average of a 2-degree difference between those rated as D in the 1930s compared to today. So residents are still feeling the impacts of historical racism that have cascaded down through housing decisions that have been made over the past almost 100 years. A lot of this is related to impervious surface. So if you look at the average impervious surface, the amount of roadway and sidewalks in these A-rated areas, it's half that in these redlined areas of D. And likewise, the tree canopy cover is much, much lower. So you see areas where it's on the order of 0% cover in these D areas, an average of 12, and up to 3 to 4 times higher in areas that were ranked as A. So what this tells us and how this is used then is it can inform things like the tree canopy assessment that the city of Boston commissioned from the University of Vermont. And so David's work was included in there, showing the value of these green spaces, this nature-based service in enhancing in environmental justice and reducing sensitivity to heat waves. So this is great, but this again is where you get into the systems thinking approach, because if this is not done carefully, what we've seen time and time again is whenever green infrastructure is implemented, things like parks, unless it is done very carefully, and especially unless it is done in cooperation with community members, it ends up leading to gentrification. And so property values raise, the people who were supposed to be benefited to begin with end up being forced out. And so careful consideration of this and implementation that do have things like rent control that make sure that the people who should be benefited are being benefited, and that this isn't contributing to gentrification is really important. So I'm out of time. I just want to finish with, again, this idea that what we're talking about here with climate justice spans everything that we do across the university, everything we do in society, where, as Jenny mentioned at the beginning, if we overly focus on technological solutions without concomitantly looking at the social economic and ecological aspects of this, is doomed to failure. And so resilient strategies have to include principles of climate justice. Otherwise, they're inherently unsustainable. And so, really what this comes down to is this quote from Einstein that, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And the same could be said for just listening to the same voices. I think Einstein's also quoted as saying that we can't get out of problems by using the same thinking that got into them to begin with. And so, when we're looking at these principles of resiliency, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusivity are not just a matter of equity and fairness. It's a core component of anything we do with resiliency. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm at my 10 minutes and we can take questions.
All right. Well, thank you. And if you don't mind, I'll go right to the chat and ask some of the questions that are there for everyone. So I think the first question that came in was, what are local groups working to change our transportation system in Massachusetts and Boston specifically? Who in the MBTA commuter rail is working to change the transportation system to being more green?
So I can respond to that. There are a lot of people working on transit equity in the Boston area, and there's been proposals for a Green New Deal for Boston that calls on making the T free, which sounds like a radical proposal. But if you think about equity and justice, our roads and bridges many of them are free, but somehow we expect people who take public transit to pay, and the fee for public transit is the same oftentimes, for everybody, which ends up having a much disparate expense and cost for folks with lower socioeconomic status. So this idea of, so there's quite a bit of conversations going on about the MBTA and the commuter rail, and with the mayor's race in Boston heating up, and also then the governor's race in Massachusetts going to be coming into the horizon pretty soon. I think public transit, and focusing on more transformative changes to how we support and invest in public transit are going to be front and center in the months to come. I don't know if Brian or Francis want to add anything to that.
No, I think that was great.
All right. So the next is more of just, I would say, I think I saw some posted in there, but if there are any links for feminist GNDs collective or an agenda, if they can be plopped in the link, or we can get them and kind of send them out to everyone in a follow-up, that'd be great. But then I think the next question that we had from one of our alums was, what steps are being taken to bridge the existing political divide as we work towards a just transition?
That's a great question, and a difficult one. I can offer some insights. I do some work with NOAA, and in some of the recent executive orders, there has been one where the creation of a climate justice working group. And I think a lot of this is focusing on solutions and working towards that, and anything bipartisan these days is going to be difficult, but I think it is taking bite-sized pieces out of it. I'm not answering this very well because I don't know how to bridge the partisan divide right now. It's a great question though, Jenny and Francis.
So I can chime in very quickly. I think in Louisiana, there are groups on the ground. I would say even the Gulf South Center for Law and Policy, who are engaging communities where folk are of all political affiliations. And so the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, they have their Go South for a Green New Deal policy platform, and they had Green New Deal town halls in multiple communities where they actually listen to folk, because sometimes it's also about code switching. You know, folk might not want to talk about climate change. That might be a politically heavy word in certain communities, but everyone wants to talk about flooding, and everyone's interested in, you know, maybe a loss of jobs and maybe in oil and gas. And so I think folk on the front lines who are in these geographies that are particularly wrought with contention over what does it look like to transition to a fossil-free future, they're actually having some of those conversations. So it's a work in progress. Also, I think the Louisiana's Climate Initiative Task Force is really interesting, because I think in terms of a just transit, I mean, this is really the first time that Louisiana has really like blatantly said, we need to address climate change. So it's really exciting. But there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pushback in Louisiana against political pushback against some of the new policies and regulations of the Biden-Harris administration, particularly like I think offshore, drilling offshore. So it's contentious, but those conversations are starting to be had. And I think what we need to be wary of, however, is folk are now saying, well, yeah, we need to address climate change. So let's focus on these like techno fixes and these large scale infrastructural solutions. Even like folk feel differently about carbon capture, which won't necessarily address longstanding racial and gender disparities. And so the question is, will this transition look like the same folk being empowered, just now under this new clean energy label? So that would be my offering to that question.
Yeah, and I would just add briefly that the proposed investments in communities that have been underinvested in for so long is a step toward both a just transition and bridging the divide, because you know, I think that the potential in front of us is for people to see and experience how big public investments will help folks, right? Whether it be helping their health, help their job situation, help them be more resilient to different disruptions associated with climate. So I think the investments themselves, even though it might be hard to get them passed, but if and when they are, and I think we're seeing that even with you know, some of the COVID recovery, people see the benefits, right? And then are supportive. So that is a way to bridge some of the political divisiveness, I think.
All right. Thank you. I think that was a good summary of all of that for that question. Moving to the next question that we have from one of our guests is, given the enormous negative externalities of big agriculture, the way that is practiced in the US and elsewhere, how can climate justice and food justice become linked in with one another in a sustainable way? I guess, and this is kind of open to all three of you.
So I can start. I mean, now I'm biased. I actually come from a food justice background before I started labeling myself as like a climate justice activist. And so I feel like they've always been linked. You know, I think that when we talk about the impacts of climate change, we have to talk about agriculture. We have to talk about the Farm Bill. We have to talk about I mean, even like, I mean, they're so connected. Like my work is focused on petrochemicals, so I guess more energy and climate justice, but we're really talking about the Mississippi River, and a lot of the issues, environmental issues we see are due to agricultural inputs, you know, fertilizers that are happening, you know, and you know, upstream and like what Minnesota and you know, it's or North Dakota. It's, yeah, there's a lot of connections when we talk about agriculture, food justice, and climate justice. And I think when we're talking in this post-COVID landscape, when we're talking about climate shocks, we really need to think about innovative ways that folk can practice food sovereignty. So a lot of the groups on the ground here in Louisiana have been focused on creating new food systems here locally, which aren't so reliant on petrochemicals. And also, I would say a lot of folk have been shifting to thinking about herbal medicine. So like the folk who are doing green infrastructure are also involved in urban gardening, creating edible landscapes within the green infrastructure. And then, also creating new mutual aid systems for food distribution. So they're linked. That's just my perspective.
I can build on that just quickly. I mean, I think at its core, a lot of these issues come down to local empowerment, right? Which is exactly what you're saying about how do you locally empower the food system. And the other piece of that is recognizing true costs. So those impacts of fertilizer and runoff from hog farms and all the other consequences of large-scale industrial agriculture that end up being a burden to somebody else downstream, and recognizing how we're going to deal with that is a huge piece of this.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mentioned the idea of energy democracy, which is about like resisting, reclaiming, and then restructuring the energy systems. And I think the very same ideas work for food systems as well, recognizing the power and influence of kind of corporate control over food, and how that's not been healthy for people, and it hasn't been leading to local and regional vibrant economies as well. So there's a lot of potential for redistributing the power and the food in the food systems as well, to create more local and regional ownership and benefits throughout the country. So that Francis mentioned food sovereignty, and that's an idea and that is very connected to the ideas of energy democracy as well.
Great, thank you. So one of the questions that actually came in from our registration thing that I think that would also be kind of interesting to kind of hear your thoughts on was how can our sustainability office here at Northeastern's community, aside from information sharing at events, help support the efforts that we're trying to do?
So I've been, as a faculty member and a researcher in this space, and somebody involved in the community, I've been quite engaged with the Office of Sustainability, and many of our students and other faculty members are as well, and staff as well. And I think there's a lot of potential for Northeastern as a university to demonstrate some more of the innovative approaches that we're talking about here within our own campus and within the various different communities that we're a part of. So I think there's a lot of potential to connect both research with experiential learning, with our campus operations and the lived experience of all of us. And our engagement with communities. So there are all kinds of things that we could do and ways that we're working on to advance some specific initiatives that kind of span a whole range of different categories. And Brian, I don't know if you want to add anything more specific. Brian's involved in some of these initiatives as well.
Yeah, you said it really well. I mean, I think I would just turn it around and say it's not so much what the Sustainability Office can do more, but it's how can the university draw on the experience of the Sustainability Office, as you said. And I think it's how do you embed core values into the university's mission that builds on the experiences of many more people than we currently do.
Great. So I think with that, we have a little bit of time left. And I think the final question that we kind of had that came in is just, more of just kind of your parting thoughts on things that our alums and guests that are here that they can kind of do in their own lives to kind of help with climate justice.
Well, I would just say get involved in and be a leader in whatever ways, wherever you are in your life. And as I said, we're all leaders in our communities, in the organizations we work with, and really work toward more transformative change. I think we're at the point where we need bigger shifts. So we really need to all be re-examining what we do, how we prioritize, and doing things differently. So, and there's so many different ways to get involved. Thank you for the opportunity and great questions.
If I can just call out, there's a chat from Marguerite that was pointing out accessibility is some of the terms and ideas here. And I think my take home would be keep talking about it and helping define those commonalities, common language, because as long as we're siloed, we're not going to get this done. And so I think it's finding that common ground.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what Jennie and Brian are stating, and particularly around accessibility of language. That's so important. I think as a feminist, we always say the personal is political, the political is personal. So it starts with yourself. Self-care is earth care. And so, educating yourself, getting involved, volunteering, civic engagement is so important. And then also having tough conversations with family members, like each one reach one. So I think that we can, transformation for me starts with the self and the community, and then you can get involved politically, and even, transnationally if you like. So there's so many ways to get involved. I think it's more like, how do we not get involved?
Yeah, and I just put in the chat, I can put the link actually. On Thursday, Francis is going to be giving a seminar, if anyone is interested, as part of the School of Public Policy speaker series. So I'm looking forward to hearing even more from Francis on Thursdays, if anyone else is interested. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you again to our speakers. I think this was very enlightening for us to kind of hear all the different things that you guys are working on and how we can kind of be involved within our own communities. To all of our guests that are on right now, I just want to say thank you to you as well for joining us. And you will be receiving a survey shortly that will have some information about this event so we can kind of continue doing programming that's best suited for our alums and our friends. So if you can fill that out, that'd be great. And then also this video will be recorded, as you all know, and will be up on our YouTube page within the next 48 hours or so. I do know that there was some questions in there about some of the links and slides that were here, and we'll work with our panel to see if we can get some of those together and be able to share that out with the people that were joining us today. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.